grateful for the Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies program, and especially Dr. Mahdavi for inviting me to this wonderful event. I'm very much pleased, honored, and grateful to be here. Now, the title of my talk, as you know, and you just heard, is Islam and the Experience of Toleration, the Past and the Future. I try to make my presentation as short as possible, so we have more time to discuss and have more conversation. As you all know, due to the process of secularization in modern era, religious authorities, they've lost their control over many social institutions, education, judiciary, sciences, and so on and so forth. And for a long time, religious communities, they felt marginalized and powerless. This sense of powerlessness and losing control led to a sense of humiliation, anger, and even hatred. They felt that, the seculars, they ridiculed them and have forced them to abandon their beliefs and lifestyles. So in reaction to the forces of secularization and this sense of humiliation and injured pride, you can see the rise of religious fundamentalism. For example, in Muslim countries, the experience of modernity has been accompanied by colonialization, military domination, imperialism, cultural humiliation, and so on and so forth. The culmination of this experience from the perspective of Muslims is the establishment of the Israeli state in 1948. Now, religious fundamentalism channels this historical anger and humiliation into violence and destructive forces to dominate the public space in order to come back to the center. In response to rising religious violence and domination, it may seem crucial for Muslims to revive the virtue of toleration as the cardinal virtue of public life and social interaction in a culturally diverse society. Of course, Muslims, they've not been a stranger to the experience of toleration in their own history. For example, historically speaking, we can recognize at least two identifiable models of toleration in Islamic history. One is the Ottoman model, and the other one is the Akbar Shah model of toleration in India. So what I'm hoping to do today is very briefly to explain the outline of these two models, the important elements and the shortcomings of these two models. And then I try to explain my philosophical analysis of the core of the concept of toleration. And third, I'm hoping to show that there are some elements within the Islamic tradition, intellectual heritage in Islamic tradition, in the classical literature and in the modern literature, that they can provide theoretical and religious justification for toleration as a virtue of public life. And finally, at the end, I'm hoping to explain some of the more important political and moral implications of this notion of toleration I'm hoping to explore in this presentation. So as I said, there are at least two identifiable models of toleration in the history of Islamic civilization. One is the Ottoman model, and the other one is Akbar Shah model. The Ottoman model was in place for about 5 centuries between 1456 and the collapse of the empire during the First World War. The model provided the Muslim community with a political and legal framework within which they regulate their relation to three non-Muslim minorities, millet, that is, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenian Orthodox, and the Jews. The Ottomans allow these minorities not only the freedom to practice their religion, but more general freedom to govern themselves in purely internal matters with their own legal codes and courts. These legal traditions and practices of each community, so the legal tradition and practices of each community, particularly in the matter of family issues, were respected and enforced through the empire. Within some limits, they were to enjoy complete self-government, obeying their own laws and customs. Their collective freedom of worship was guaranteed, together with their possession of churches and monasteries, and they could run their own schools. However, the Ottoman model had its own limitation. Here, I like to emphasize three of those shortcomings or problems or challenges this model was facing. The first one, although these religious minorities in Ottoman Empire, they were free to run their own internal affairs, their relations with the ruling Muslims, they were tightly regulated. For example, non-Muslims, they could not convert to any religion but Islam. They could build new churches, but only under license. They were required to wear distinctive, dress so that they could be recognized. And there were limits. There were limits in intermarriage, and they had to pay a special tax in lieu to military services. So the relation to the Muslim community was, as you can see, tightly regulated. Second, the religious leaders of each millet, or those religious minorities, they did not necessarily tolerate the individual dissent within their own constituent communities. Heresy and innovation were subject to harsh punishment. And the Ottoman rulers, they did not interfere with their decisions in this regard. They had freedom to do whatever they want to the, those heretics within the religion. So the religious leaders, they had authority over their constituency with regards to religious matters. And sometimes they used their authority to suppress or even eliminate religious dissents in their own community. And finally, the historical record suggests that in practice, religions have usually felt most violently intolerant, not of other religions, but of dissenters within their own rank. That is why in the Ottoman model, the Muslim community was extremely harsh with respect to those Muslims who converted to other religions. These quote unquote heretics were subject to severe punishments. So as you can see, according to Ottoman model, Islamic authorities, they gave qualified permission to the minorities to live according to their own beliefs on the condition that the minorities accept the dominant status of Islam in public spaces. So the Ottomans accepted the principle of tolerance, where that is understood to indicate the willingness of a dominant religion to coexist with others. In other words, so long as the minority groups, they did not claim equal public and political status, and they did not challenge the power and authority of the dominant religion, of course, under those conditions, they were tolerated. Of course, this toleration, this kind of practice had some reasons. The Ottoman Empire had reason to justify this kind of toleration. For example, they had pragmatic concerns. The Ottoman correctly, they recognized that this form of toleration is the least costly of all possible alternatives to successfully rule over a very culturally diverse territory. But not only practical concern, there were some religious justification for this practice of toleration. For example, we know that in a traditional Islamic jurisprudence, there were a specific view on the people of the book, Ahlul Kitab, and the Quran and the traditional Islamic jurisprudence prescribe some level of toleration toward the people of the book. However, the model of toleration in this type of toleration is based on hierarchical power relation of domination. That is, the Muslim community, which had the power to interfere with the practices of non-Muslim, nevertheless decided to tolerate them, while the non-Muslim community accepted their own inferior position. This notion of toleration, even though supported by traditional Islamic jurisprudence, at least in my view, is not the kind of toleration Muslims they need in order to challenge religious fundamentalism and to peacefully coexist with non-Muslims within the house of Islam or elsewhere. That is why, in my view, the second model offered by Akbar Shah has clear advantages. Akbar Shah, the Muslim empire of India in the late 16th century, suggested a different model of toleration. His model was based on at least three important foundations. First, he acknowledged and recognized the internal diversity of India and the plurality of religions in his territory. And he embraced the regular presence of a multitude of beliefs and convictions. Of course, at some point, he introduced a new notion of a kind of universal religion. He talks about Tarikh Ilahi, divine history, or Deen Ilahi, or divine religion, as an effort to have a more comprehensive religion that creates some sort of overarching unity in India, while of course at the same time he was firmly acknowledged the plurality. That attempt of course failed, but it doesn't change the fact that he was quite keen and respectful of the diversity in his own territory. So the second foundation was the fact that Akbar Shah, insisted on the need to have conversations and interchanges among holders of different beliefs and convictions. He arranged systematic dialogues in his capital city between Hindus, Christians, Muslims, Jains, Parsis, Jews, and others, even including agnostic and atheists. He emphasized the role of reasoning in this public dialogue. He held that reason, and I'm quoting, reason cannot but be supreme, since even when disputing reason, we would have to give reason for that disputation. So reason is always there. He believed that the pursuit of reason, rather than reliance on tradition, is the way to address difficult social problems. According to him, the path of reason, or the rule of the intellect, Rah-e Aql, must be basic determinant of good and just behavior, as well as of an acceptable framework of legal duties and entitlements. He insisted that, we should be free to examine whether, reason does or does not support any existing custom or provides justification for the ongoing policies. On such grounds, Akbar Shah abolished all special taxes on non-Muslims and released all the imperial slaves. And finally, the third foundation in Akbar Shah model was that the state must be equidistant from different religions and must not treat any religion with a special favor. The duty of the state, from his perspective, included making sure that no man should be interfered with on account of his religion, and anyone was to be allowed to go over to any religion he or she pleased. So Akbar Shah's model, as you can see, it was based on three important assumptions: the equality of all citizens, rational dialogue in public space among people who hold different beliefs and values, and the principle of state neutrality. In this context, toleration is not based on domination, but mutual respect. And it seems that this is a kind of toleration Muslim communities need in order to peacefully coexist with others in modern time. So the central question, it seems to me, is whether or not in modern time we can revive Akbar Shah's model and recognize the respect conception of toleration as a part of our social and political ethos. So here I like to explain how I'm understanding this respect conception of toleration implied in Akbar Shah's model of toleration. To my understanding, the core of the respect conception of toleration is to recognize and respect people's right to be wrong. In other words, toleration is possible if one believes that, you have right to do something while that thing is morally wrong, at least from my perspective. So you are about to do something, and from my perspective, doing that thing is morally wrong, but at the same time, I respect your choice to do that action. Therefore, according to this analysis, the idea of the right to be wrong consists of two distinct notions of right. One is being right, and the other one is having a right. There are two different notions. While we are using the same word, right, but we are using this concept in two different senses. Being right is a property we normally attribute to beliefs and practices. And having a right is a property we normally attribute to belief holders, to the agents. This understanding of toleration requires us to accept a principle, I call it the principle of toleration. What is this principle? The principle says, from the fact that, let's say you are doing certain action that is morally wrong, it doesn't follow that, you have no right to do it. From the fact that that action is morally wrong, it doesn't follow that you don't have right to do it. And it doesn't follow that I have a duty or I'm allowed to interfere with you doing that, right? So you have a right to be wrong. The fact that that action, that belief is wrong, does not deprive you from doing it, and it does not give me the permission or the duty to interfere and prevent you from doing so. In other words, there is no logical relation of entailment between being right and having a right. If I want to use a more fancy way to articulate it, I would put it like this. That means one can be obtained consistently without the other one. Now, one important implication of this position is that people's having rights does not and should not depend on those people's holding true beliefs. People are allowed to hold false or wrong beliefs so long as those beliefs do not cause any immediate, serious, detectable harm to a specific group of people in the community. And as long as this condition is satisfied, people's rights should be protected and people's rights should not be compromised. So according to this analysis, the virtue of toleration is a respect for the agent's autonomy and rational choices. So I respect your choice, but respecting your choice doesn't mean I agree with the choices you made. I respect your rationality, but that doesn't mean necessarily that I accepted the outcome of your rational reasoning. What is to be protected by virtue of toleration is your ability to choose, the ability to exercise your reason. And that seems to be the essence of humanity in one respect. This idea of toleration allows Muslims to hold their belief that Islam is, in some important respect, the truth, or at least is closer to the truth than any other religion. That means they hold some sort of exclusivist approach to their own religion, and at the same time allows them to recognize others' right to believe and live as they choose, even though from the perspective of the Muslim, that belief or that kind of lifestyle, it doesn't seem to be right. Now, if that is the case, now we can articulate our central question rather differently. Now the question is whether or not Muslims as such, Muslims as Muslims, whether or not they can recognize the right to be wrong as a part of the social and political ethos. Here, I like to discuss very briefly the outline of two arguments in favor of right to be wrong, as presented by some Muslim scholars. The first argument, you can find the elements of this argument in Muslims' classical literature, in some of the arguments presented by Mu'tazili and Ash'ari theologians. And the second one is a kind of argument you can find, at least the important elements of the argument in the work of some contemporary Muslim scholars. The first argument is articulated on the basis of some important remarks made mainly by Mu'tazila, but as I said, you can find the elements of this argument among Ash'ari theologians as well. The topic at hand was, from their point of view, was the idea of true faith in Islam. The question was, on what ground one can reasonably accept Islam as the true religion? So it was a matter of the foundation of faith, how you come and why you come to believe in Islam, for example. So they offered two alternative choices. They said, look, the ground for this belief could be one of these two choices. One, God himself, one might say, God himself, in his word, in his book, that is the Quran, commanded us to accept Islam as a true religion. That's one possibility. The second possibility is you come to that belief independently based on your own human reason, right? So they said we have two sources. Either we have to rely on revelation, or we have to rely on independent natural reason. However, there is a problem with the first option. That is, the first option leads to a kind of vicious circle. Why? because the authority of the Quran as God's word depends on one's belief in Islam as a true religion. If you don't believe in Islam as true religion, then you have no reason to consider the Quran as God's word and feel obligated to follow its commands. So the first option is out. You are left with the second option. Therefore, the only reasonable ground for accepting Islam as truth is human, natural, or independent reason. Now, reason and reasoning in this context must be independent of any religious sources of authority. Here we have the notion of independent reason as the prerequisite of true belief in Islam. Human free will and independent reason, according to this argument, are necessary conditions for authentic faith. Therefore, according to this view, Muslims as such are required to cultivate and protect a social and political environment in which it is possible to freely exercise rationality. Now, you can see this line of reasoning implies that salvation is more accessible if the beliefs are developed freely. An environment in which people can form genuinely autonomous belief is more hospitable to salvation. And the function of the right to be wrong is nothing but to serve, protect, and foster human rationality and free choices. So if we refuse people's right to be wrong, that means that freedom to choose freely and rationally, regardless of the outcome, we've denied them their autonomy and freedom, and thus we've denied them the right to salvation. So if Islam and faith is important to you, you have to respect humans' rationality, independent reasoning, and human choices and free will. So you can see, based on this argument, you can create a room or some sort of justification for right to be wrong. Right to be wrong as a right that protects humans' independent reasoning and humans' freedom of choice. The second argument I like to discuss is based on some ideas presented by Mahdi Khairi Yazdi, an Iranian scholar of Islam who passed away in 1999. In his book, Hikmat wa Hukumat, Wisdom and Government, he used some version of this argument, of course, mainly to justify the idea of democracy within Islamic intellectual tradition. I modified and changed his argument a little bit so to apply it to this case at hand. So this argument, we can articulate it in terms of few premises. The first premise in this argument is that the public space in a given society is a common property, milk-e mushab, of all citizens. And from this respect, no one has any advantage over anyone else. All citizens are equal in this respect. This notion of common property, which is actually a Lockean notion in modern political science, this notion of common property or milk-e mushab is quite a well-known concept in traditional Islamic jurisprudence. And Khairi simply extended its application to the public sphere. That's the first premise. The second premise is a widely acceptable article of traditional Islamic jurisprudence, الناس مسلطون على أموالهم. That means people, they have full control over their properties. And again, this is quite a well-known principle of Islamic jurisprudence. And finally, the third principle, or the third premise, is a version of the principle of justice or fairness, according to which, since all the shareholders, they have equal rights to the common property, it follows that they have equal right to effectively participate in the process of running and controlling the common property. No shareholder has the right to rule the common property, and in this case, that means this public space, by enforcing laws and policies which are justifiable on the grounds which are available only to some groups of the shareholders, right? So in this case, that means everyone needs to chip in. Everyone needs to actively and effectively participate in making public decisions. So what follows from this argument? I believe this argument, which is actually implies the respect conception of toleration, has some important practical and political implications. Not only for Muslims, but I think for other members of the society as well. And we may call, these conclusions, these principles, as moral and political ethos of public life in a culturally diverse society. What follows from this notion, this conception of toleration? First, coercive laws and public policies should be based on public reason and reasoning. Public reason requires that the moral and political rules that regulate our common life be in some sense justifiable or acceptable to all those persons over whom the rules purport to have authority. This implies that no purely religious reason can be the sole justification for public policies and coercive laws. That's one principle. The second principle claims that citizens ought to refrain from using their political influence to authorize coercive laws and policies for the public life that, to the best of their knowledge, can be justified only on religious grounds, and so lack a plausible public and common rationale. Of course, it is permissible for religious people to advocate laws and policies which are rooted in their own religion, as long as in the context of a political discussion, a political discourse, they are able to defend and justify them in terms of public reason. So it is perfectly fine if you learn something from your religion and you believe in it and you cheer for it, you advocate as a part of the public policy, so long as you can defend that idea in terms of public reasoning. And finally, within civil society, religious groups should have the right to establish their own voluntary religious communities. And within such communities, the members should be allowed to organize their own community on the basis of some laws and policies which are solely based on religious sources and authorities. Within this voluntary community, you are allowed to have rules, regulations, laws that they are solely rooted in religious sources and authorities, with one important qualification. That is, these laws should not violate the very basic human rights guaranteed for all the members. So these principles, which are, in my view, extremely important for the public and political life, are ultimately justified on the basis of the principle of justice. Justice, in this context, mainly, especially political justice, is in the first place a matter of keeping to principles that can be adopted by all members of any plurality of potentially interacting beings, that is, beings who share a world. Okay, thank you very much. There is a misconception among Muslims that, our religious duty is to make sure that religion dominates public sphere. That means the laws of Sharia they should regulate every aspects of every, lives of every citizen in the society. So in that case, the concept of citizenship is very muddy. That is why I suggested this idea that instead of trying to religiously justify civil society and citizenship, we should advocate and cheer for a religion which is consistent with the requirements of civility, a kind of civil society. So we are not a member of an ummah, a community based on faith. We are a member of a society in which, individuals, they have independent right to pursue their own understanding of good, the comprehensive notion of good. So the question is how we can come together while we are acknowledging that there are some disagreement among the members that cannot be reconciled. At the same time, we can treat each other with respect and fairness. This is the central question in Rawls' theory of justice. I think it is quite meaningful for a religious member of the community, as well as, non-religious member of the community. So in this context, I think, given the analysis I suggested, we need to be the citizen of the society first, and within our voluntary religious communities, we can practice our religion and act according to the laws of our religion. So there is a tension between the notion of being citizen of the society, that means the one who is committed to every member of the society considered to be equal. We are engaged in rational conversation in order to reconcile social and political disagreements. Every member of the society should have equal right to express their view, and every member of the society should have equal right to actively participate in making policies and laws that, influence his or her life. So this notion is rather different than being a member of a religious community. And this temptation that we have religious duty to overcome, to dominate public sphere, unfortunately, it's a very tempting misconception. And many, even modern Muslim scholars who advocate democracy and secularism, in a way and in a mild way, they try, in a hidden, secret way, they try to find a way to bring religion in this sense into the public life. Do you think it is possible to distinguish the concept of history from Western Marxist viewpoint from the Anfusi history? Should we consider the history of 12 Shia Imams as a history which has happened in the past, or a history which is still alive and ongoing? You can have your own conception of history. That is fine. The problem is, when it comes to public life, we should act based on the conception that can be shared, and based on reasons and conceptions which are accessible to other shareholders of the public life, this common property. So you might believe, for example, that there is a 12th Imam that is coming in the future, and he's going to save all the humanities. That's perfectly fine. But as soon as you say, because of this belief I have, therefore I have privileges in public life, and I have a special, right to make decisions that affect every member of the society, then we are in trouble. So it depends. within the voluntary religious community, you can, conduct your life as you please with some qualification. But as soon as you want to participate in public life, you should be very mindful what you bring to the public life, right? And if my argument is valid and sound, you are religiously obligated to bring only those beliefs to the public life that you can defend them in terms of common and public reasoning. So as a religious man or a woman of faith, it is quite, plausible for me to have a kind of end of the world or some sort of believe in some sort of Messiah, and you interpret the history in terms of these notions. But this idea should not interfere with the laws and policies which are regulating, the public life in a very culturally diverse society. You're absolutely right. The notion of toleration I presented here, it has three important components. One is a belief component, according to which, you believe that, your belief, what you're holding is true, and the other party holding something wrong or false. That's the belief part. However, there is some sort of will part or desire component into toleration. And the desire is, even if I believe your position is wrong or false, I have this desire to peacefully coexist with you, to peacefully live with you in the same society. And there is a third component, which actually is directly related to your question, and it's a matter of demarcation, the criteria of demarcation. That means the concept of toleration can exist only if we can distinguish between two different categories. One, the falsehood, the wrongness that can be tolerated, and the wrongness or wrong deeds or beliefs that cannot be tolerated, right? So you need to be able to make that distinction. So we need a criteria based on which to make that distinction. What are those classes of wrongs that can and should be tolerated, and what is the class of wrongs that cannot and should not be tolerated? In my talk, actually, in passing, I gave you my own criteria. I said, from the fact that the belief is false, never, ever follows that, the belief holder should be deprived from his or her rights. Having false belief has nothing to do with that person's rights, social, political, civil rights. However, if that belief, that false belief, leads to immediate, serious, detectable harm to a specific, detectable group of people in our society, then harm principle actually prevents us from, it gives us the permission to put some restrictions on that belief and the belief holders. So not the harm, the falsehood of the belief, but the harm that comes from the belief, it functions as a demarcation criteria. So that means those wrong beliefs who lead to immediate, serious, detectable harm to a specific group of people in society, there are type of wrongs that cannot and should not be tolerated. Otherwise, the mere fact that the belief, at least from our perspective, is wrong or false is not sufficient to give us the permission or duty to prevent those people from acting or promoting those beliefs. But my question is, what strategies can be implemented to actually achieve freedom, tolerance, and understanding within our community, and especially in Islam? This is a very tough question. And actually, I'm glad that you raised this question. I have to say, the argument I presented here, in any kind of discussion like this, we should distinguish between two different contexts: the context of justification and the context of implementation. For example, we want to know whether or not there is such right as right to be wrong. This is a context of justification. And the second step is, now we establish that there is such a right. The next question is whether how we are supposed to implement that right, to promote that right, to make it, accessible to people, to create an environment in which people they can actually exercise this right. That's the question of implementation. My talk was solely about the state of justification. I simply wanted to say there is such right to be wrong, which is actually, in my view, it's the heart, the core of toleration. That's first. And secondly, acknowledging, accepting this right has some important political and moral implications in public life. Now, another very difficult question is, okay, it's all good and sound, let's say, but in reality, how we can convince religious communities and non-religious communities to commit themselves to this right. In that case, I think the problem is not restricted to this case. Let's say you have, you believe, women, they should have equal rights as men, equal right. So at the stage of justification, you provide different arguments to explain why, in your view, discrimination based on, gender is unjust, right? This is a huge and important task, but it is not the end of the story. This is simply a theoretical matter, which is important in its own right. However, the second important question is, now we are convinced that, discrimination based on gender is unjust. How we can convince this, a paternalistic, male-dominated society, men and women, to, embrace this idea and incorporate this value in their own lives? The second question is beyond the reach of a theologian and philosophers. It is the task of, political scientists, sociologists, psychologists. It's a part of the public education to teach next generation these values. The sources of authority in societies, artists, athletes, to in different ways, to promote those values. To be honest, I don't have any clear answer to this question. It is beyond my expertise. But I believe, engaging in the kind of conversation we have here, it is the first step. At least, we have a clear mind whether or not there is such right and what are the implications of this right. When we have a clear idea of what we are claiming, what we are demanding, then I think it becomes much easier to plan some practical project to implement, to cultivate that virtue as a public life. I think you're absolutely right. For example, one of the major sources of violence in many religious communities, specifically, as far as I know, for example, in Muslim communities, it's a matter of poverty. Poverty is the main source of violence. Social and economic inequality is the main source of violence. Nowadays, environmental crisis, there are great sources of violence and humiliation and injured pride and the sense of powerlessness. These internal wars in Syria, in other places, people, they lose everything. They have nothing to appeal to. So these are some of the real world causes of violence. So the theoretical discussion we've had here, does it solve those problems? Obviously not. And as long as you have those real life problems, this theoretical discussion on the right to be wrong wouldn't help much. However, it doesn't mean that, the discussion at theoretical level is redundant and we should abandon that level of conversation. No, we need to know what we are aiming at, set the goal right, and of course the rest is political and social and psychological and economic challenges to create a more just, more egalitarian society, to remove major sources of violence in our society. So at best, I believe this notion of toleration sets a goal. We are hoping to get to a society in which the virtue of toleration becomes a part of the fabric of the society, a part of social, political, and moral ethos in our society. The rule according to which we treat other members of our community, Muslim or non-Muslim. But this is simply setting the ideal. But how we can get from here now to that ideal, that's a different story. We need to change many, real realities in our society, not only internal matters, but international matters. We are living in a world in which the gap between haves and have not is increasingly growing. And, in this society, people, they feel, they left behind, they are ignored. Of course, it creates anger, frustration, and it leads to violence, and it creates an environment in which religious fundamentalism actually can mobilize people and provide a channel that anger to its own cause. Yeah, I think it is fair to say, while this kind of discussions, that means trying to justify these values from within our culture is essential. The task actually, John Rawls invite all members of different cultures to do it, and Naim initiated this process in Islamic world. While these are important to provide cultural justification, internal cultural justification for these values, but I think it is simple-mindedness if we believe that is all we need to do. At best, we set the ideal, we try to clarify it, we try to justify it based on the cultural elements familiar to us, but then we should be mindful that there are much, much, much more needs to be done. This idea of liberty, at least it is very important to me, not necessarily as a part of liberalism, as an ideology, but as a fundamental principle of public life. People should have the liberty to pursue their own conception of good. However, it seems to me the liberty, the freedom of religion is also as important, and it's a part of the, liberty in our society. People should be able to pursue their own religions and, what they consider to be divine laws and prescriptions. So how we can reconcile these two? On one hand, we need to be citizens in this, liberal community. And on the other hand, we need to be a devout Muslim or Christian or Jews. How we can reconcile these two aspects? This is a tough question, and I'm not quite sure if I have a very, precise and ready answer to this question. However, it seems to me the concept of voluntary religious community is a way I try to reconcile these two sides of the debate. That means within the civil society, we have different groups that they come together and they form voluntary communities. I emphasize voluntary communities. By that, I mean people freely join the community and they have real choice to leave the community without any consequences, serious consequences, right? For example, in Islam, the idea of irtidad actually it's a very dangerous idea, because it says you are free to join the community, but as soon as you join the community, you cannot leave it, right? That means as long as the concept of irtidad is a part of our, jurisprudence or ilm al-fiqh, then we are in trouble, because we cannot form voluntary Islamic communities. That is why I think, we have to criticize this idea of irtidad in Islamic jurisprudence, as many, Muslims, they try to do exactly the same thing. Now, if you have a voluntary religious community within the civic society, then in that case, I think within that community, you should have more freedom to exercise your religion. When you are in public sphere, your freedom of religion should be within the realm of rationality, within the realm of common reason. But within the voluntary religious community, you shouldn't be limited to that restriction. Within that community, you can exercise your religion, you can follow the moral and the religious codes, maybe the religious courts, you can have your own schools, you can have your own courts, and so on and so forth. With one actually important qualification, as I mentioned it, that means you should not violate the very basic human rights of the members. So freedom of religion, I think, is important. And in order to protect and preserve freedom of religion, we must be willing to compromise some of our principles when it comes to voluntary communities. Within those voluntary communities, people must be able to act according to their own comprehensive conception of good. But as soon as they try to come out of that community and influence public life, then they need to change their hat. Now, I'm not a Muslim, but I'm Muslim and a citizen. And as a responsible citizen of my community, I need to make sure I'm advocating public policies and laws, coercive laws, that can be defended in terms of common reason. Now, being a civilized Muslim, Christian, Jews, in my view, means, learn how to make that transformation. When you are within the society, you wear one hat, and when you come to the public sphere, you need to wear another hat. It doesn't mean religion has no place in public life, not at all. It simply means when you are trying to pass laws and policies that influence everyone's life, as I discussed in my presentation, you are morally, and in my view, religiously obligated to respect the principle of justice and fairness. And that principle requires you not to, impose laws or policies on people's life based on, principles which are not accessible to them. It is beyond their reach. So the way probably we can reconcile these two sides, liberty and freedom of religion, is to make distinction between voluntary communities within the civil society and the restrictions of actively participating in public life in terms of common reason.
Thank you very much. Very thoughtful answer. I can see one more rather long question, if you don't mind.
Oh, yes. So there's definitely a resounding advantage to toleration. I assume it is advantage to toleration. However, toleration under the pretext of democratization brought about the hallmark of the end of the Western and by extension Eastern civilization, especially with regard to egalitarianism in freedom of expression and the significance attached to it. The hierarchical model, instead of a flat horizontal one, which is characterized in the Ottoman model, seems rational and more practical. I wonder what your view are on this issue. And which model you feel like is more utilitarian? Can the two be reconciled, and therefore a third model? Uh, uh, yeah, who knows? Maybe there are more than two models. What I suggested, these are two identifiable models within the Islamic tradition. And who knows, maybe we can come up with a third model. But my problem with the Ottoman model, it is a model of based on domination and hierarchical power relation, in which the dominant religion, the ruling religion, does not allow others to influence public life if that influence challenges its dominance. That seems to me unfair, unjust. Now, you might say, I'm Muslim and the Ottoman model works just fine for me. Yeah, but what if you were not a Muslim in that community? You need to decide from behind a veil of ignorance. Imagine you are not a member of the dominant religion. In that case, you would find it unfair to be deprived from, actively participate in making policies and laws that directly or indirectly influences your life. So if you put yourself in, the shoes of other parties, then you might find the Ottoman model unfair. Having said that, given the circumstances at the time, that was the best deal available. That is why many Jews, they actually left the Christian territory for Muslim territory, Islamic territories. Why? Because Christians, they didn't show that level of tolerance toward Jews, and they had to leave, they leave their home, their lands behind, and move to the land of Muslims, because that level of toleration, at least it provided them with some dignity, which was better than what was available to them at the time. But now we are living in a different time. This is a kind of social structure we are hoping for. I don't think so. Not my moral intuition and my religious commitment tells me that this is not fair. This is not something that God wants to see. That a group of people dominate the every other groups and subordinate them. It seems to me fair if everyone has equal right, access to the public life, and they try to argue based on common ground to regulate public life. That seems to me more respectful, morally just. So we have two alternative models. One is the model based on domination, hierarchical power. The other one is based on mutual respect. The structure of the power in the second case is based on some sort of social agreement people reach based on common reason and reasoning. The second model seems to me morally more plausible. Let's put it this way. Now, can we have a combination of these two? Maybe, but I don't know what that could be. The Ottoman model actually captures the ancient world, the pre-modern society. I think they didn't have this, at least, the dominant view was what we capture in Ottoman model. Even in the Golden Age, I think we had different parts of the Islamic world with different degrees of toleration. But ultimately, I think the core, the heart of the social and political structure, this is what can be captured in Ottoman model. The Akbar Shah model was an absolute minority, and he actually failed in a way to continue that model. He had to, set back to some extent. Of course, later on in India, in modern India, when they tried to draft the constitution, the modern constitution of India, Akbar Shah was a major source of inspiration. So he played his own role in modern, constitutional democracy in India. But as far as I can tell, Akbar Shah is an exception. The dominant political structure in Islamic world, in ancient world, in pre-modern world, at best, this is something you can find in Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard to find any signs of Akbar Shah models in today's India, where there's systematic, of course, exclusion, marginalization of Muslims.
Yeah.
But
on paper, they try to, they're inspired by the Akbar Shah. You're absolutely right. The reality is something different.
Yeah.
Maybe
the same problem somehow in Turkey under Erdogan's authoritarianism, right?
You are absolutely right. But I think, a part of the deal is, this must be an ongoing conversation among Muslims and non-Muslims. And we set a goal and we try to, strive to get there. We are not there yet. And that is why the kind of conversation we have here is essential, is important for Muslim and non-Muslims equally. I have to thank, everyone for showing up. I understand, this is a very difficult, distressful time for everyone. And I truly appreciate you joining this event and engaging in this conversation. So I think part of the solution, not the solution, but part of the solution is, we encourage this kind of conversation among ourselves, Muslim and non-Muslims. This problem is not restricted to Muslim communities. Christian in United States, we are dealing with some version of this problem. In Israel, Jewish community, they are dealing with some version of this problem. Fundamentalism among Hindus, fundamentalism is a serious problem in modern time. It's a harsh, violent reaction to, the experience of modernity in many parts of the world. And at least in my humble opinion, probably the cure, as far as the ethics of the situation is concerned, is try to promote this virtue of toleration as a part of our moral and political ethos. So I think these conversations we have, it's a part of the solution. Hopefully, it make us to think more and more on this subject matter and come up with some sort of practical plans to implement these values as a part of our social fabric and mindset.